March 12, 1945. 32 German women arrived at Camp Liberty, Pennsylvania in a transport truck meant for 40. They didn't need the extra space. Together, they weighed less than 2,000 pounds, an average of 71 pounds per woman. The youngest weighed 67. Her name was Margaret Keller. She was 24 years old. She had been a radio operator in Berlin, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt full. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us share more stories like Greta's. Now, let's continue. The truck's engine died with a shudder that seemed to echo through the women's hollow bones. For a long moment, nobody moved. Moving required energy. Energy required food. Food was something that existed in memory, not reality. Margaret Keller. Greta. To anyone who'd known her before the war, sat in the back corner of the truck bed, her spine pressed against cold metal. She'd chosen this spot deliberately. It required the least movement when the truck stopped. Every choice she made now was about conservation. Energy was currency, and she was bankrupt. The American guard who opened the tailgate didn't speak. He just stared. His face did something Greta had learned to recognize over the past 3 months of captivity, that particular expression of shock when someone confronted starvation for the first time. His eyes moved from woman to woman, taking inventory of protruding collarbones, sunken cheeks, wrists thin as broom handles. Greta watched him count silently. She'd done the same thing in the processing camp in France. 32 women, 16 pairs, 8 groups of 4. Numbers were safe. Numbers didn't require feeling. The guard cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice carried a thickness that suggested he was working very hard not to show emotion. "Welcome to Camp Liberty. Please exit the vehicle slowly. Medical personnel are waiting." His German was terrible but understandable. Greta filed this information away. American guards who learned German were either very dedicated or very kind. She wasn't sure which possibility frightened her more. The women began to move. It was a production of careful choreography, each one calculating how to stand without falling, how to step down without collapsing. Greta waited until half the truck had emptied. Patience was another form of energy conservation. When her turn came, she gripped the tailgate with both hands. Her fingers looked like bird bones wrapped in paper. She'd stopped looking at her hands weeks ago. They belonged to someone else now. Some other Margaret Keller who'd existed in a different world. The ground seemed impossibly far away. 18 inches, a distance she'd once crossed without thought. Now it required planning, commitment, faith that her legs would hold. She stepped down. Her knees buckled slightly, then locked. Victory. The woman beside her wasn't so fortunate. She was younger than Greta, 21, maybe 22. Her name was Elizabeth Hartmann, though everyone called her Elsa. She'd been a clerk in Munich before the war, before the hunger. Elsa's legs gave out completely. She crumpled like paper, hitting the gravel with a sound that was more air than impact. The American guard lunged forward, catching her before her head struck the ground. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, because she didn't. 93 pounds. Greta had heard the medics say it during processing. "I need help here," the guard shouted. 2 more Americans appeared, one of them carrying a stretcher. They moved with the efficient urgency of people who understood that time mattered. Greta filed this away too. Americans who cared if German prisoners lived or died. The pattern didn't fit. She'd been told Americans were brutal, that they tortured prisoners for sport. That capture meant death, just slower and more humiliating than a bullet. But these men were gentle with Elsa. They checked her pulse. They spoke in low, reassuring tones, even though she probably couldn't understand English. One of them, a sergeant with red hair going grey at the temples, looked up at the remaining women with something that looked almost like anguish. "How long?" he asked in broken German. "How long since real food?" Nobody answered. The question was too complicated. Did he mean real food or food? Did he mean a full meal or any meal? Did he mean food that wasn't moldy or food that wasn't made from sawdust and hope? Greta's last real meal had been October 1944. Potato soup with actual potatoes in it. Her mother had made it using the last of their ration tickets. Her mother Ilse had given Greta her own portion and claimed she'd already eaten. Greta had believed her because believing was easier than fighting. Easier than admitting that her mother was starving so she could eat. That had been 5 months ago. 153 days. Greta counted everything now. Days, calories, heartbeats, hours since she'd last seen her mother standing in the rubble of their apartment building, watching the evacuation truck pull away, watching her daughter abandon her. The sergeant was still waiting for an answer. Greta heard her own voice, distant and unfamiliar. Long time. Her English was better than his German. She'd studied it before the war, back when she'd dreamed of traveling to America to see the jazz clubs she'd heard on illegal radio broadcasts. Back when the world had been bigger than the distance between her bed and the food line. The sergeant nodded slowly. He didn't ask anything else. Maybe he understood that some questions had answers too terrible to speak aloud. The medical examination took place in a building that had probably been a warehouse before the military transformed it into a processing center. The walls were bare concrete. The ceiling was open beams and exposed pipes. It should have felt cold, institutional, frightening. Instead, it felt warm, actually warm. Greta hadn't been warm, truly warm, since the fuel rations had stopped in January. She stood in the examination line, feeling heat soak into her bones like water into parched earth, and tried not to cry. Crying required moisture. She didn't have moisture to spare. The doctor who examined her was older, maybe 60, with hands that shook slightly as he lifted his stethoscope. He introduced himself as Dr. Wilson. His voice was kind. Greta had learned to distrust kindness. Kindness was usually a prelude to cruelty, a way of making the inevitable hurt more. "I'm going to listen to your heart," he said in careful German. "This won't hurt." He was right. It didn't hurt. His hands were warm. The stethoscope was cold for only a moment, then it too absorbed her body heat, what little she had. Dr. Wilson's face did something complicated as he listened. His jaw tightened. His eyes closed briefly. When he opened them again, Greta saw something that looked almost like grief. "How old are you?" he asked. 24. He wrote something on his clipboard. His hand shook more. Height. 163 centimeters. She didn't know what that was in the American measurements. 5 feet and change, she thought. Not tall, not short. Average in a world that no longer existed. Weight. She didn't answer. She'd stopped weighing herself in December, when the scale in the bunker had read 42 kilograms, and she'd understood that numbers could be weapons. Dr. Wilson guided her to a scale in the corner. It was mechanical, balanced with sliding weights. Honest, brutal. The weights settled. 67 pounds. Dr. Wilson wrote this down without comment, but his hand was shaking so badly now that the numbers were barely legible. "Margaret," he said quietly. "That's your name, correct?" "Yes. Greta." "Greta." He tasted the name, making it soft. "I need to examine you further. I need to check your organs, your reflexes, your cognition. I need to understand." He stopped, started again. "I need to help you. Do you understand?" She understood that he was asking permission. This was new. Permission implied choice. Choice implied power. She had neither. "Yes," she said. The examination was thorough and surprisingly gentle. He checked her eyes, her throat, her heartbeat. He tested her reflexes with a small hammer that made her knee jerk involuntarily. He asked her to count backwards from 100. She made it to 73 before her concentration faltered. When he was finished, he helped her sit on the examination table. The paper covering crinkled under her weight, what little weight she had. "Greta," he said carefully, "I'm going to be very honest with you. Your body is in the process of shutting down. Your heart is weak. Your organs are beginning to fail. Without intervention, you have perhaps 3 to 4 weeks to live. She absorbed this information with the same detachment she'd absorbed everything else for the past 6 months. Death was just another number to count, another calculation to make. But, Dr. Wilson continued, with proper nutrition and care you can recover. Your body is young. It wants to live. We can help it live. Do you want that? The question caught her off guard. Want. Such a strange concept. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her what she wanted. My mother, Greta heard herself say, is in Berlin, Soviet zone. I don't know if she's alive. Dr. Wilson's expression softened further, which seemed impossible. There wasn't much more softness available in the human face. Then you need to live to find out, he said simply. You need to live to find her. It was the right answer, the only answer. Greta felt something crack inside her chest, not her ribs, though those were fragile enough. Something deeper, some wall she'd built between herself and hope. She nodded. Once. Definitive. I want to live. The mess hall was larger than any dining facility Greta had seen outside of propaganda films about American abundance. Long tables stretched in precise rows, each one set with actual plates, not tin mess kits, not wooden bowls, actual ceramic plates with a blue rim pattern that suggested someone somewhere had cared about aesthetics even in a prison camp. There were forks and knives laid out as if this were a restaurant rather than a military facility. There were cloth napkins folded into triangles. There was a serving line where American soldiers in kitchen whites waited behind steel warming trays. It was wrong. All of it. Wrong in a way that made Greta's chest tight with something that felt like panic. The 32 women filed into the mess hall in silence. They'd been given fresh clothes, plain grey dresses that hung loose on their diminished frames but clean. Actually clean, smelling of soap and sunshine instead of sweat and fear. They'd been allowed to shower. The water had been warm. Greta had stood under the spray for exactly 3 minutes before her mind had started screaming about waste about her mother, who had no water, about the impossibility of warm showers while the world was burning. Now they sat at the long tables, one woman every 3 feet, as if proximity might be dangerous, as if hunger were contagious. Greta chose a seat near the middle of the second table, strategic positioning, close enough to observe, far enough to retreat if necessary. Old habits from the radio room where she'd learned that survival meant reading the room before the room read you. The woman who sat beside her was the oldest of their group, 27, though she looked 40. Her name was Hildegard Brenner, but everyone called her Hilda. She'd been a secretary in Hamburg before the war. She'd told Greta during processing that she had 2 sons, 11 and 8, last seen when Hamburg was evacuated. Their location was unknown. Hilda's hands were folded in her lap. She was staring at the empty plate in front of her as if it might vanish if she looked away. The kitchen staff emerged carrying trays. The smell hit first. Meat. Actual meat. Cooked meat. Seasoned meat. The smell of it rolled through the mess hall like a physical wave, and Greta heard the collective intake of breath from 32 women who'd forgotten that food could smell like something other than rot and desperation. The soldier serving their section was young, maybe 28, with dark hair and steady hands. His name tag read Kowalski. He set a plate in front of Greta with the careful precision of someone handling something precious. She looked down. 2 thick slices of meatloaf occupied half the plate. Rich brown gravy pooled around them. Mashed potatoes formed a generous mound on one side, butter melting into a golden pool at the summit. Green beans, actually green, not the grey-brown of overboiled vegetables, occupied another section. A slice of white bread, soft and perfect, sat on the rim. This was more food than Greta had seen in a single meal in over a year. This was more food than her entire family had received in a week during the final months in Berlin. This was impossible. Her hands remained in her lap, unmoving. Around the mess hall, the other German women sat in identical frozen positions, 32 women staring at 32 plates, none of them reaching for their forks. They had been trained by deprivation to expect tricks, to anticipate that abundance was always an illusion. that food offered freely was food laced with poison or humiliation or some punishment too terrible to imagine. Greta's mind was working through calculations. If this were real food, why would Americans give it to German prisoners? If this were poisoned, why make it look so elaborate? If this were a test, what were they testing for? The red-haired sergeant from the truck appeared at the front of the mess hall. He was carrying a plate identical to theirs. He sat down at the nearest table in full view of all 32 women. He picked up his fork, cut into the meatloaf, took a bite, chewed, swallowed, took another bite. His face showed nothing but simple pleasure in eating. No performance, no exaggeration, just a man eating a meal. He looked up at them. His eyes moved from woman to woman, making contact, holding it. "It's real," he said in his broken German. "It's yours. Eat." Nobody moved. Private Kowalski brought out a second plate, set it in front of the sergeant. The sergeant ate from that one too, methodically, calmly, demonstrating with his body what his words couldn't convince them of. "Essen ist echt," Kowalski added in worse German than the sergeant. "Kein Gift." Food is real. No poison. Greta heard her own voice quiet enough that maybe only Hilda could hear. "This is psychological warfare. They're fattening us for something worse." Hilda didn't respond. She was still staring at her plate. A single tear tracked down her weathered cheek, cutting through the dust that seemed permanently embedded in all their skin now. The sergeant finished both plates, stood, walked to the kitchen, returned with a third plate, ate half of that one too. Then he spoke again, louder this time, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "In America, we don't starve prisoners, even German ones. This is dinner. Tomorrow there is breakfast. The day after there is lunch. The food doesn't stop. You are safe here." The words were simple. Too simple. Greta's mind tried to find the trap in them, the hidden clause, the inevitable betrayal. But her body wasn't listening to her mind anymore. Her body had smelled meat and potatoes and butter, and it was staging a rebellion. Her hands lifted of their own accord. Her fingers closed around the fork. The metal was cool and solid and real. She looked at the meatloaf. Steam was still rising from it in delicate wisps. The gravy had pooled in the cuts where a knife had separated the slices, creating dark rivers of richness. Greta cut a small piece. The fork went through the meat like it was soft as butter. She lifted it to her mouth. The smell intensified. Salt and beef and onions and something else, maybe tomato, maybe paprika, maybe just the pure, concentrated essence of food that hadn't been stretched with sawdust and lies. She put the fork in her mouth. The meat dissolved on her tongue. It wasn't tough. It wasn't dry. It was tender and rich and savory and so overwhelmingly real that for a moment Greta forgot where she was. She forgot the camp. She forgot the war. She forgot the hunger that had been her only constant companion for so many months. She forgot her mother. And then she remembered. The meat turned to ash in her mouth. Her throat closed. Her stomach, which had been sending desperate signals of yes, more please, suddenly twisted into a knot of pure guilt. Somewhere in Berlin, her mother was eating bark. Maybe she was already dead. Maybe she'd died yesterday or last week, or the day after Greta had left her standing in the ruins. And here was Greta sitting in an American prison camp eating meatloaf that probably cost more than a month's rations in Germany. Eating food that was soft and hot and perfect while her mother, if she was still alive, was scavenging through rubble for anything that wouldn't kill her immediately. Greta forced herself to swallow. The meat went down like broken glass. She cut another piece. Smaller this time. Ate it. Forced it down. Cut another piece. This was survival. Dr. Wilson had said she had 3 to 4 weeks without intervention. Her mother had told her to live. Living required eating. But every bite tasted like betrayal. Across the table, Hilda had started eating too. Slow, methodical bites, tears streaming silently down her face. The woman next to her, a younger girl named Elsa, who'd been carried in on a stretcher, was eating with shaking hands, her face blank except for her eyes, which held a kind of desperate confusion. One by one, the 32 women began to eat. The mess hall filled with the quiet sounds of forks on plates, of careful chewing of women who'd forgotten how to trust their bodies to process food. Greta made it through half the meatloaf before her stomach sent a warning signal. She stopped, set down her fork, breathed. The sergeant was watching, not in a threatening way, more like a doctor monitoring a patient. When he saw her stop, he nodded slightly as if in approval. "Slow is good," he called out in German. "Your body needs time. Tomorrow you eat more. Next week, even more." Next week. The concept seemed impossible. Next week required a future. Futures were luxuries Greta had stopped believing in. But her plate was still half full, and the sergeant had said there would be breakfast tomorrow. Tomorrow. That night, Greta lay in a real bed with clean sheets and a pillow that didn't smell like mold, and tried to sleep. The barracks were warm. Actually warm. There was a heating system that worked, pumping warmth into the room with a steady mechanical hum that should have been comforting. Instead, it was torture. Her mother didn't have heat. Her mother didn't have clean sheets. Her mother didn't have meatloaf sitting heavy and rich in her stomach. At 3 in the morning, Greta got up and walked quietly to the latrine. It was a modern facility with running water and actual toilets and sinks that worked. Another impossibility. She knelt in front of the toilet and vomited up everything she'd eaten. Not because her body rejected it. Her body had been grateful. Her body had processed the food with desperate efficiency. She vomited because her mind couldn't accept it. Because every calorie felt like theft. Because somewhere in the ruins of Berlin, her mother was dying and Greta was eating American meatloaf. She stayed on the floor for a long time after her stomach was empty, forehead pressed against the cool tile, shaking. A door opened. Footsteps approached. Greta didn't look up, didn't care who found her like this. "Greta," the sergeant's voice. Of course. He probably patrolled at night, probably checked on the prisoners, probably had seen this before, women who couldn't accept kindness because kindness felt like betrayal. He didn't ask if she was okay. The question would have been stupid. Instead, he sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the wall. He was in his undershirt and uniform pants, suspenders hanging loose. He'd clearly dressed quickly. They sat in silence for several minutes. Greta's shaking gradually subsided. Her breathing slowed. The floor stopped spinning. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was raw from vomiting. "My mother is eating bark. Maybe she's eating rats. Maybe she's already dead. And I just ate 6 ounces of beef and creamed potatoes and I can't..." Her voice broke. "I can't carry this." The sergeant was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft but firm. "My grandmother's name was Siobhan O'Malley. She died in Ireland in 1847. She was 34 years old. She weighed 48 pounds when they found her. Her lips were green because she'd been eating grass. She had half a potato in her pocket. She was too weak to eat it." He paused. Greta could hear him breathing in the dark. "My grandfather was 12 when his mother died. He survived. He got on a boat to America. When he arrived in Boston, strangers gave him his first real meal. He told me he cried through the whole thing. He told me he felt guilty for every bite. He told me it took him 3 years before he could eat without feeling like he was betraying his mother." Another pause. And then one day, he realized something. His mother didn't give up her food so he could die of guilt in America. She gave up her food so he could live. And living, real living, meant letting go of the guilt. It meant eating the food, building a life, having children who would never know hunger. The sergeant shifted slightly. Greta could feel him looking at her in the darkness. "Your mother didn't give you her bread so you could vomit up American meatloaf and die in a Pennsylvania latrine. She gave you her bread so you could survive, so you could find her, so you could live the life she wanted for you." Greta's throat was tight. Not from vomiting this time. "You don't understand." "I understand that guilt is easier than hope," the sergeant interrupted. I understand that punishing yourself feels like loyalty. I understand that eating feels like betrayal when someone you love is starving. His voice softened further. But here's what my grandfather taught me. The dead want the living to live. Always. Your mother, wherever she is alive or dead, doesn't want you vomiting up the first real meal you've had in months. She wants you to eat. She wants you to get strong. She wants you to survive. Silence filled the space between them. Greta could hear the heating system humming, could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the sergeant's steady breathing beside her. Tomorrow, he said quietly, you're going to eat breakfast. You're going to keep it down. And the day after, you're going to eat lunch. And every day you're going to eat a little more, and your body is going to remember how to live. And when you're strong enough, we're going to help you find your mother. She's in the Soviet zone, Greta whispered. You can't help with that. Watch me. The certainty in his voice was almost offensive. How could he be so sure? How could he promise things that were impossible? But then again, 3 days ago, warm beds and meatloaf had seemed impossible too. The sergeant stood, offered his hand. Greta took it. He pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness, as if he understood that her bones were more fragile than they looked. Go back to bed, he said. Tomorrow starts in 4 hours. You need to be rested. Greta nodded, turned to leave, then stopped. Sergeant, what's your name? O'Malley. Patrick O'Malley. Thank you, Sergeant O'Malley. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you're eating thirds at dinner and your mother's standing beside you. It was an impossible promise, but Greta found herself wanting to believe it anyway. The next 6 days passed in a strange fog of routine. Wake at 6, shower with warm water, dress in clean clothes, eat breakfast, rest, eat lunch, rest, eat dinner, sleep. Each meal was generous, each meal was difficult, but each meal Greta managed to keep down a little more. Her body was responding. She could feel it. The constant dizziness was fading. Her hands didn't shake as much. The fog in her brain was lifting, replaced by something that felt almost like clarity. On the morning of the 7th day, March 19th, Greta woke to unusual activity in the camp. Soldiers were moving with purpose. The kitchen staff had been working since before dawn. Something was different. At breakfast, Sergeant O'Malley stood at the front of the mess hall and made an announcement in his careful German. Today is St. Patrick's Day. In Ireland and in America, we celebrate this day with a special meal. It's a tradition that goes back many years. Today, you will share in this tradition. Today, everyone in this camp is a little bit Irish. Greta had no idea what St. Patrick's Day was, but she understood traditions. She understood that traditions were how people marked time, created meaning, built something larger than themselves. She also understood that whatever was coming was significant. She could see it in O'Malley's face, in the way the kitchen staff was moving with extra care, in the tension that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the mess hall. Lunch was skipped. They were told to rest, to save their appetite for dinner. Greta spent the afternoon trying to read an English-language newspaper that someone had left in the barracks, but her mind couldn't focus. Her body knew something was coming. Her stomach, which had finally stopped sending constant distress signals, was sending new signals now. Anticipation, maybe even hunger. At 5 o'clock, they were called to the mess hall. The room had been transformed. Green paper streamers hung from the ceiling. A small hand-lettered sign read, "Happy St. Patrick's Day," in both English and German. The tables were set more formally than usual, with extra napkins and what looked like actual glasses instead of metal cups. The 32 women filed in and sat. Greta chose her usual seat. Hilda sat beside her. Elsa, who'd gained 4 pounds and could now walk without assistance, sat across from them. They waited. The kitchen doors opened. Sergeant O'Malley and Private Kowalski emerged carrying enormous platters. The smell that preceded them was unlike anything Greta had experienced in the camp so far. Salt, meat, spices, something sweet and savory at once, something that smelled like abundance and celebration and joy. They began serving. Each woman received an identical plate. When Kowalski set Greta's plate in front of her, she forgot to breathe. A massive slice of corned beef, pink and tender, studded with peppercorns and cloves, dominated the plate. It was easily 3 inches thick, the meat so tender that it was already beginning to fall apart at the edges. Beside it sat a mountain of boiled cabbage, bright green and glistening with butter. Baby potatoes, skins still on, rolled in parsley. Glazed carrots. A thick slice of dark rye bread with butter melting into golden pools on top. This wasn't a meal. This was a feast. This was abundance made manifest. This was impossible. Greta stared. Around the mess hall, 32 women stared in identical silence. Sergeant O'Malley stood at the front of the room. He was in his dress uniform, buttons polished to a high-shine face, serious but not unkind. He began to speak. His German was still broken, but the emotion behind it was crystal clear. This meal is called corned beef and cabbage. It is what Irish people eat on St. Patrick's Day to remember where we came from, to remember the hard times, to remember that we survived. He paused, looked at each woman in turn. My grandmother died eating grass. My grandfather survived by leaving everything he knew and coming to a country that didn't want him. The first real meal he ate in America was this meal. Strangers gave it to him, people who had no reason to be kind to a sick Irish refugee boy. Another pause. His voice grew stronger. He told me before he died, Patrick, when you eat, you honor the people who couldn't. When you waste food, you spit on their sacrifice. Ladies, I don't know where your mothers are, your sisters, your daughters. But I know this: if they're alive, they want you to live. If they're dead, they need you to live. The silence in the mess hall was absolute. 32 women holding their breath, holding their grief, holding their impossible guilt. This meal isn't propaganda, O'Malley continued. It's not a trick, it's a promise. In America, we don't let people starve. We don't turn refugees away. We don't punish children for their government's crimes. This meal is what America is supposed to be. Kindness to strangers, second chances, hope. He picked up his own fork, cut into his own plate of corned beef, lifted it to his mouth, chewed, his eyes closed. When he opened them again, they were wet. Eat, he said simply. Please, eat and live. That's how you honor them. Greta's hands lifted, not by conscious decision. Some deeper part of her, some animal survival instinct that predated guilt and grief, was taking control. She cut a small piece of corned beef. The fork went through it like warm butter. She lifted it to her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt first bright and intense, then the meat itself tender, almost sweet, with layers of spice she couldn't identify. Peppercorn, clove, maybe bay leaf. The fat melted immediately, coating her mouth with richness. It was the most delicious thing she'd ever tasted. More than delicious. It tasted like safety, like abundance, like the opposite of everything the past year had taught her. It tasted like her mother's love. The thought hit her like a physical blow. Her mother, who'd given Greta her own rations, who'd sent her away to survive, who'd stood in the ruins watching the truck disappear because she loved her daughter more than she loved her own life. This meal, this impossible, generous, abundant meal, this was what her mother had wanted for her. Not survival, not mere existence, but this, life, real life. The kind of life where meals were celebrations and strangers were kind and the world offered second chances. Tears spilled down Greta's cheeks. She took another bite, and another, each one a defiance of the guilt that said she didn't deserve this, each one a prayer that wherever her mother was, she was somehow feeling this too, this warmth, this fullness, this taste of forgiveness. Around the mess hall, other women were eating. Many were crying. Some were silent, but all of them were eating, taking these bites of hope, these mouthfuls of possibility. This feast that said you are not your government, you are not your past, you are not beyond redemption. Greta ate slowly, tasting everything. The cabbage was buttery and soft. The potatoes were perfectly cooked, their skins crispy, their insides fluffy. The carrots had been glazed with something sweet honey, maybe that balanced the salt of the beef. Halfway through her plate, she had to stop, not from guilt this time, from fullness, actual physical fullness. Her stomach was sending signals she'd forgotten existed enough. Satisfied, content. She set down her fork, looked at Sergeant O'Malley, who was watching the room with an expression of fierce satisfaction. Their eyes met across the mess hall. Greta mouthed 2 words in English, words she'd been practicing. "Thank you." O'Malley nodded once. Then he smiled. It transformed his entire face, made him look younger, almost boyish. "You're going to make it," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "All of you, you're going to make it." For the first time since Berlin burned, Margareta Keller believed him. The week following St. Patrick's Day brought a transformation that went beyond physical recovery. The 32 women of Camp Liberty were gaining weight an average of half a pound per day, Dr. Wilson reported, with something close to wonder in his voice. But the change ran deeper than numbers on a scale. They were beginning to believe the food wouldn't stop. Greta had gained 9 pounds in 2 weeks, 67 to 76. Her face had begun to fill out, the sharp angles of her cheekbones softening slightly. Her hands no longer looked like bird skeletons. When she stood up, she didn't have to calculate the energy cost anymore. Her body was remembering how to be a body instead of a survival equation. But with physical recovery came mental clarity. And clarity meant facing everything she'd been too exhausted to feel. March 24th arrived with cold rain that drummed against the barracks roof. Greta lay in her bunk, listening to the water, thinking about her mother. It had been 39 days since she'd last seen Ilse Keller standing in the rubble. 39 days without knowing if she was alive or dead. Without knowing if the choice Greta had made to leave to survive, to abandon her, had been worth it. The guilt came in waves now instead of a constant flood. "Progress," Dr. Wilson said. Greta wasn't sure progress was the right word for learning to live with betrayal. A knock on the barracks door interrupted her thoughts. One of the American guards, a young woman named Corporal Jensen, stood in the doorway. "Keller, Captain Brennan wants to see you, now." Greta's stomach dropped. Captain Dorothy Brennan was the camp commander, a woman in her early 40s with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to see through pretense. Greta had only met her once during initial processing. A summons to her office couldn't be good. She dressed quickly, fingers fumbling with buttons that no longer hung loose on her frame, followed Corporal Jensen through the rain to the administration building. Captain Brennan's office was sparse but warm. A small electric heater hummed in the corner. The captain sat behind a desk, covered with paperwork, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up when Greta entered. "Sit." Greta sat, her hands folded in her lap. Old habits from interviews with Nazi officials who'd had the power to send her family to camps. Brennan studied her for a long moment. Then she pushed a folder across the desk. "This came through Red Cross channels this morning. Your mother, Ilse Keller, born 1894. Last confirmed address, Berlin-Mitte district." The world narrowed to the folder. Greta's hands reached for it but stopped halfway. Schrödinger's cat. As long as she didn't open it, her mother was both alive and dead. Opening it would collapse the possibility into a single terrible truth. "Open it," Brennan said quietly. Greta opened it. The first page was a form mostly bureaucratic language she couldn't process. Her eyes skipped to the bottom, to the box marked Status. Deceased. The word sat there like a stone, heavy, permanent, undeniable. Date of death, March 22nd, 1945. 10 days ago. While Greta had been eating corned beef and gaining weight and sleeping in warm beds, her mother had died. While Sergeant O'Malley had been teaching her that survival was victory, her mother had been drawing her last breath in the ruins of Berlin. The folder contained more pages. Greta's hands moved mechanically, turning them. A death certificate signed by a Soviet medical officer. Cause of death, starvation. Weight at death 41 kilograms, 90 pounds. Her mother had weighed 90 pounds. Had lost 40 pounds in the months since Greta had left. Had given all her rations away to neighbours according to a witness statement. had told everyone her daughter was alive, and that was all that mattered. The final page was a note handwritten in German from a neighbor named Frau Schmidt. "Your mother spoke of you constantly. She was so proud you had escaped. She died believing you were safe. It gave her peace at the end. I thought you should know." Greta set the folder down very carefully. Her hands were steady. That was strange. She felt like she should be shaking, should be screaming, should be something other than this terrible crystalline calm. "I'm sorry," Captain Brennan said. Her voice was genuine. "I debated whether to tell you, but you have a right to know." Greta nodded. Once. Precise. "Is there anything you need? Someone you want to talk to?" "No." Her voice sounded normal. That was wrong. Everything was wrong. "Take the rest of the day. Rest. Dr. Wilson can give you something if you need help sleeping." "Thank you, Captain." Greta stood, walked out of the office, down the hall, out into the rain. She didn't run, didn't rush, just walked with careful, measured steps back toward the barracks. Halfway there, her legs stopped working. She sat down on the wet ground, rain soaking through her dress, and understood that the guilt had been right all along. Her mother had died while she was eating bacon, had died while she was complaining about fullness, had died believing Greta was safe, which was true, which made it worse. The rain was cold. Greta was glad. She deserved cold. She sat there for an hour before Sergeant O'Malley found her. He didn't say anything, just sat down beside her in the mud, letting the rain soak through his uniform. They sat in silence while the water pooled around them and the sky pressed down grey and heavy. Finally, Greta spoke. "March 22nd. That's the day I ate seconds at dinner. I remember because I was so proud of myself. I ate an extra piece of chicken, and I felt victorious." Her voice was flat. She was dying that day, and I was eating chicken. O'Malley let the words settle before responding. "My grandfather got the news about his mother 6 months after she died. He was in Boston working in a factory eating 3 meals a day. When he found out, he stopped eating for a week. Nearly died himself. Good. No, not good. Because then my great-uncle, his brother, who'd stayed in Ireland, sent him a letter. Want to know what it said?" Greta didn't answer. O'Malley continued anyway. "It said, 'Ma didn't die so you could starve yourself in America out of guilt. She died so you could live. If you waste that, you make her death meaningless. Eat the damn food and build the damn life she wanted for you.'" The rain was letting up. Greta could see individual drops now instead of sheets of water. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't eat, knowing she starved." "You can't eat to honor her starvation," O'Malley corrected. "Every meal you eat is a middle finger to the war that killed her. Every pound you gain is proof that she won. She kept you alive long enough to escape. You survived long enough to be saved. She won, Greta. Don't turn her victory into defeat by dying of guilt." The words were harsh, too harsh. Greta wanted to argue, wanted to explain that he didn't understand, couldn't understand, would never understand the weight of abandoning your mother to death. But somewhere under the guilt, a small voice whispered, "He's right." Her mother had given her bread, had pushed her onto that evacuation truck, had stood in the ruins watching her daughter leave because she wanted Greta to live. Dying now, whether from starvation or guilt, would make that sacrifice meaningless. It didn't make the guilt disappear, but it gave her something to do with it. Greta stood. O'Malley stood with her. They were both soaked through mud-covered, shivering. "I need to eat dinner tonight," Greta said. "Yes. I don't want to." "I know. But I need to." "Yes." O'Malley walked her back to the barracks, waited while she changed into dry clothes, then walked her to the mess hall for dinner. The meal was pot roast with potatoes and carrots. Simple, abundant, impossible. Greta sat at her usual seat, stared at her plate, picked up her fork. Every bite tasted like grief. Every swallow felt like betrayal, but she ate anyway, slowly, methodically, because her mother had died wanting her to live, and living required eating. Across the table, Hilda was watching her with knowing eyes. Hilda, who had 2 sons somewhere in the Soviet zone, who didn't know if they were alive or dead, who ate every meal like it was prayer. "Your mother?" Hilda asked quietly in German. "Dead, March 22nd. Hilda reached across the table, squeezed Greta's hand, said nothing. There was nothing to say, but her hand was warm, real, a reminder that Greta wasn't the only one carrying impossible weight. That night, Greta didn't vomit. She lay in her bunk feeling the pot roast sit heavy in her stomach and cried until she couldn't anymore. Then she slept, dreamless, heavy, the sleep of someone whose body was too tired to maintain grief at full volume. When she woke, she'd gained another half-pound. The following days blurred together. Wake, eat, mourn, sleep, repeat. Greta moved through them mechanically, but she moved. She ate every meal. She gained weight. 76 pounds became 79, then 82. Her body was healing even as her heart stayed broken. On April 3rd, Captain Brennan called another meeting. This time all 32 women were summoned to the mess hall. They filed in with the wariness of people who'd learned that gatherings usually meant bad news. Brennan stood at the front of the room, hands clasped behind her back. Sergeant O'Malley and Private Kowalski flanked her. Their faces were carefully neutral. "Ladies," Brennan began in careful German, "as of April 1st, the United States War Department has authorized a new program for certain categories of prisoners of war, specifically those who can demonstrate rehabilitation, secure American sponsorship, and publicly renounce totalitarian ideologies." She paused. Let the words sink in. What this means in practical terms, if you can find an American citizen or organization willing to sponsor you, if you pass security screenings, and if you are willing to formally reject Nazi ideology and pledge loyalty to democratic principles, you may apply for asylum in the United States. The mess hall erupted. Not with noise, these women had learned to be quiet, but with sudden movement, heads turning, eyes widening, hands gripping table edges. Asylum, America, staying. Greta's mind was working through the implications. America meant safety, meant food, meant distance from the ruins of Berlin. But it also meant abandoning any hope of finding her mother's grave, meant admitting that Germany, her home, her language, her entire life, was gone forever. Brennan held up a hand for silence. "The deadline for applications is June 30th. That gives you 12 weeks. I won't lie to you, the process is difficult. Background checks are thorough. Sponsorship is hard to secure. Many of you will be denied. But for those who succeed, this represents a genuine second chance." Hilda's hand shot up. "What about family? Can we bring family members?" Brennan's expression softened. "If you can locate them, and they're in Allied zones, yes. We have Red Cross resources available. But I must be honest, for family members in Soviet-controlled territory, the situation is much more complicated." Hilda's face fell, but didn't break. She nodded, lowered her hand. Another woman, a younger girl named Helena Schmidt, who'd been increasingly vocal about her continued Nazi sympathies, stood abruptly. "This is propaganda. You're trying to turn us into traitors. You want us to betray everything we fought for." The room went silent. Greta had noticed the growing divide among the prisoners. Roughly half had begun to accept American kindness as genuine. The other half, led by Helene, maintained that this was all psychological warfare, that the kindness would end, that they were being fattened for some worse punishment. Brennan's voice remained calm. "Miss Schmidt, you're free to reject the program. You're free to return to Germany when the war ends. But I'd ask you to consider, what exactly did you fight for? Was it the propaganda that told you Americans would torture prisoners because you've been here 3 weeks and nobody's been tortured? Was it the promise of German superiority because Germany is in ruins while American camps have heat and regular meals?" Helena's face flushed red. "You don't understand. You can't understand.
My father died believing in the Reich. My brothers died fighting for it. If I denounce that their deaths mean nothing—" "Their deaths mean nothing anyway," Greta heard herself say. Every head turned toward her. She hadn't intended to speak, hadn't planned to engage, but the words were coming anyway, pushed out by 3 weeks of grief and clarity. "Your father died for lies, Helene."
My father died in a British bombing raid in 1943. He was a radio engineer. He never hurt anyone. He died because of a war started by madmen. My mother died eating bark because those same madmen destroyed our country's food supply. Their deaths don't mean something just because we die too. Their deaths mean something if we learn from them. Helena's eyes narrowed. "You're a traitor." "I'm a survivor. There's a difference." The confrontation hung in the air. Then Hilda stood supporting Greta. "I have 2 sons. Maybe they're alive. Maybe they're dead. But if they're alive, I want them to grow up in a country where leaders don't send children to die in pointless wars. If that makes me a traitor to the Reich, then I'm a traitor. I'm also a mother, and mothers protect their children even from their own governments." One by one, other women stood. Not all of them, but 18 of the 32. 18 women who'd decided that survival wasn't betrayal, that choosing life wasn't weakness. The 14 who remained seated, Helene's faction stared at them with expressions ranging from disgust to pity. Brennan waited until everyone had settled. "I need decisions by tomorrow morning. Those who wish to apply for asylum will work with Sergeant O'Malley on securing sponsorships. Those who wish to return to Germany will be transferred to a standard POW facility to await repatriation." She dismissed them. The mess hall emptied slowly, women clustering into their chosen groups. The division that had been forming for weeks was now visible concrete, irreversible. Greta found herself standing with the 18 who'd chosen America. Hilda was there. Elsa. Others whose names she'd learned over shared meals and quiet conversations. Sergeant O'Malley approached their group. "Ladies, I'm going to be honest with you. Securing sponsorship is hard. Most Americans don't want to sponsor former enemy soldiers, even women, even ones who've renounced their governments. But I'm going to help you, every single one of you." "Why?" The question came from Elsa. "Why do you care what happens to us?" O'Malley's expression was complicated grief and determination, and something that looked like old pain. "Because my grandmother died when people who could have helped didn't. Because my grandfather survived when strangers chose kindness over hate. Because I'm tired of wars that punish children for their leaders' crimes. And because—" He looked directly at Greta. "Because I've watched you fight for every single meal. I've watched you choose life over guilt. I'll be damned if I let bureaucracy undo that." He pulled out a notebook already filled with writing. "I've been working on this since St. Patrick's Day. I have contacts, churches mostly, some veteran organizations, businesses that need workers. Here's what we're going to do." For the next hour, he outlined a plan. Each woman would be matched with potential sponsors based on their skills and backgrounds. Greta, with her radio experience and English ability, would be connected with Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia, which ran a radio station and needed operators. Elsa, who'd been a clerk, would be sponsored by an Irish bakery owner in Boston, a Mrs. Kathleen Murphy whose son had died in the war, and who wanted, in O'Malley's words, someone to mother. Hilda's case was more complicated. Her sons were in Soviet-controlled territory. O'Malley couldn't promise they'd be found, but he could promise he'd use every resource available. Catholic Relief Services is negotiating prisoner exchanges with the Soviets, he explained. "It's slow, it's frustrating, but they're getting some orphans out. I've already submitted your sons' names to their database." Hilda's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you doing this? We were your enemies." O'Malley's smile was sad. "You were never my enemy. You were just women on the wrong side of a war you didn't start. And now the war's almost over and you get to choose who you become next. I'm just making sure you have that choice." The meeting ended near midnight. The 18 women walked back to the barracks in silence, each processing what asylum would mean, what it would cost, what it would require.
Greta lay in her bunk that night thinking about her mother's last words, the words she'd spoken in German when she pushed Greta onto that evacuation truck. Geh mein Kind, solange es Leben gibt, gibt es Hoffnung. Go, my child. While there's life, there's hope. Her mother had wanted her to live, not just live, build a life, find joy, create meaning from the ashes. America wasn't home, would never be home. But maybe home was something you built rather than something you were born into. Maybe home was corned beef and cabbage served by an Irish sergeant who'd lost his grandmother to famine. Maybe home was the possibility of second chances. Maybe home was learning that kindness could cross enemy lines. Greta closed her eyes. For the first time since March 22nd, she didn't dream about her mother dying. She dreamed about her mother smiling, pushing her onto that evacuation truck, saying, "Go," with love instead of goodbye. When she woke the next morning, she weighed 84 pounds. She was going to make it to 100, and then she was going to build a life that would make her mother's sacrifice mean something. She was going to become American. The asylum applications began on April 5th. 18 women sitting at long tables in the camp's administration building, filling out forms in a language most of them barely understood. Sergeant O'Malley moved between them, translating questions, explaining bureaucratic language that seemed designed to confuse. Greta stared at the first question on her form. State your reasons for seeking asylum in the United States of America. How did you compress survival into a box that allowed 50 words? How did you explain that your mother had died so you could fill out this form, that every meal you'd eaten in this camp had taught you that the propaganda had been lies, that you wanted to live in a country where kindness to enemies wasn't considered weakness? She wrote simply, "I wish to live in a country where people are fed, not starved, where truth matters more than propaganda, where I can build a life that honors my mother's sacrifice." 43 words. It would have to be enough. The FBI investigation came 3 weeks later. Greta was in the mess hall eating lunch chicken soup with actual chunks of chicken, fresh bread and apple when Corporal Jensen appeared at her elbow. "Keller, visitor." The word visitor sent ice through Greta's chest. Visitors meant complications. In her experience, complications meant danger. The man waiting in the interview room wore a dark suit and had eyes that catalogued everything. He introduced himself as Special Agent William Harrington, Federal Bureau of Investigation. His German was flawless, which somehow made him more threatening. "Miss Keller, please sit." Greta sat, her hands folded in her lap. Every instinct from living under the Nazi regime was screaming warnings. "I've been reviewing your asylum application. I have some questions." "Of course." Agent Harrington opened a folder, pulled out a document. Greta recognized it, her work history from the radio operations bunker in Berlin. "You worked as a radio operator for the German military. Senior position, clearance for encrypted communications. You were present during strategic operations in the final months of the war." These were not questions. These were accusations with question marks removed. "Yes." "You had contact with Soviet forces during the collapse of Berlin." "I was captured by Soviet soldiers. That's not the same as contact." "Explain the difference." Greta's voice remained steady, but her hands tightened in her lap. "Contact implies communication, cooperation. What happened was soldiers breaking into our bunker, pulling us out at gunpoint and—" She stopped, breathed. "And doing what soldiers do to women they find in bunkers." Agent Harrington's expression didn't change. "So you claim you were assaulted?" "I don't claim. I state a fact. Facts require evidence. Evidence requires someone believing women instead of dismissing them." The words came out sharper than Greta intended. Agent Harrington made a note. She'd made a mistake. Showing emotion was always a mistake with men like this. "Miss Keller, you understand my position. The Soviet Union is no longer our ally. They're a threat." A German radio operator with Soviet contact applying for American asylum raises questions. "I'm not a Soviet spy." That's what a Soviet spy would say. The logic was circular, inescapable. Greta felt the walls closing in, not the walls of this room,
but the walls of a future where she'd be denied asylum, sent back to Germany, back to the ruins and the starvation and the death. The door opened. Sergeant O'Malley stepped in without knocking. "Agent Harrington, I need to speak with you. Now." Agent Harrington's jaw tightened. "Sergeant, I'm conducting an interview, and I'm informing you that you're interrogating a protected POW without proper authorization. Captain Brennan requires your presence. Immediately." The two men stared at each other, some silent battle of wills that Greta didn't fully understand. Finally, Agent Harrington stood. "This interview is suspended. Miss Keller remain available." He left. O'Malley stayed, waited until the door closed before speaking. "You okay?" Greta's hands were shaking now that the immediate threat had passed. "He thinks I'm a spy. He thinks everyone's a spy. It's his job." O'Malley sat down across from her. "But here's what he doesn't know. Captain Brennan has documentation of every woman in this camp. Medical records, testimony from the soldiers who liberated your group, evidence of what happened to you during Soviet capture." He pulled out a cigarette, then seemed to think better of it and put it away. "He wants to deny your asylum because you're German and he's suspicious. I want to approve it because you fought like hell to survive and you deserve a chance. Captain Brennan wants to approve it because she's read your file and knows you're not a security threat. Guess whose opinion matters more? His. He's FBI. She's the camp commander, and she outranks local FBI jurisdiction on POW matters. He can make recommendations, she makes decisions." O'Malley leaned forward. "Trust me, Greta. I'm not letting some paranoid agent destroy your application because he can't tell the difference between a survivor and a spy." Greta wanted to believe him, but belief required energy she didn't have. What if he wins? Then we fight harder. It was the kind of simple, stubborn answer that Greta was learning was characteristic of Patrick O'Malley. The man who fed starving Germans corned beef. The man who wrote 63 sponsorship letters. The man who apparently fought FBI agents for women he'd known less than 2 months. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care this much?" O'Malley was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried old pain. "My grandmother died because people who could have helped didn't. Because English landlords saw Irish Catholics as less than human. Because when you decide someone isn't worth saving, it's easy to let them starve." He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the camp yard. "I watched my grandfather die when I was 12. He was 84, still had nightmares about the famine, still woke up checking if there was food in the cupboard. 70 years in America, and he never stopped being afraid the hunger would come back." O'Malley turned back to face her. "Before he died, he made me promise something. He said, 'Patrick, if you ever have the power to help someone who's starving, you help them. You don't ask if they deserve it. You don't ask what country they're from. You help them because nobody helped my mother, and she died eating grass.'" His voice roughened. "You showed up here weighing 67 pounds. I could count your ribs through your shirt. You looked exactly like the photos my grandfather showed me of famine victims, exactly like them. And I made him a promise." Greta felt something crack in her chest, not breaking opening. "Your grandmother would be proud." "I hope so." O'Malley moved toward the door, then paused. "Agent Harrington is going to keep investigating. Let him. You've got nothing to hide. And you've got me, Captain Brennan, Dr. Wilson, and about 40 other people in this camp who'll testify that you're exactly what you claim to be, a survivor trying to build a life." He left. Greta sat alone in the interview room, feeling something she hadn't felt since before Berlin burned. Hope. The sponsorship approval came on June 15th. Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia had reviewed Greta's application, conducted their own interviews, and agreed to sponsor her asylum request. They would provide housing employment at their radio station WPHL and English lessons. In exchange, she would work as a radio operator and help with German-language broadcasts. When O'Malley delivered the news, Greta cried, not from grief this time, from relief so profound it felt like physical pain.
She weighed 97 pounds now, close to normal. Her face had colour. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. She was becoming a person again instead of a survival mechanism. By late June, all 18 asylum applications had been processed. 14 were approved. 4 were denied due to security concerns or lack of sponsorship. The 4 denied women would be transferred to standard POW camps to await repatriation to Germany. Hilda Brenner's application was approved with a special notation pending location of minor children. Catholic Relief Services had confirmed that her sons Klaus, now 13, and Werner, now 10, were alive in a Soviet orphanage in East Berlin. Negotiations for their release were ongoing. Elsa Hartmann was approved with sponsorship from Kathleen Murphy's bakery in Boston. Mrs. Murphy had written in her sponsorship letter, "I lost my son at Normandy. I can't bring him back, but I can help a girl who lost everything. Maybe that means something." The departures began in July, but before the women left Camp Liberty, there was August 6th. The news came through military channels first, then radio broadcasts, then newspapers. The words seemed impossible even as Greta read them. Atomic bomb. Hiroshima. Entire city destroyed. Casualties estimated at 70,000 to 80,000 immediate deaths. The mess hall was silent that evening. Even the Americans seemed shaken. The scale of destruction was beyond comprehension, beyond anything the war had produced so far. Greta sat with her dinner pot roast potatoes, carrots, bread, and understood something that made her stomach turn. Germany would have used this weapon. If German scientists had developed it first, they would have dropped it on London, on Paris, on Moscow. And she would have believed it was justified. She would have believed the propaganda that said enemy civilians were acceptable casualties, that total war meant total destruction. She would have been wrong, just as the Americans might be wrong now. But the crucial difference was that she could see it now, could understand that every government had lied, every side had committed atrocities, every nation had convinced its people that the enemy was less than human. The weapon that killed 70,000 people in seconds was terrible, but the propaganda that made such weapons thinkable, that was the real horror. She wrote in the journal O'Malley had given her, "Today I learned that we would have done the same, that my country's moral superiority was a lie, that their moral superiority is also a lie, that maybe no country gets to claim righteousness in war. Maybe the only victory is refusing to let war make you inhuman. Sergeant O'Malley fed me when he could have starved me. That's the only moral clarity I have left. Kindness to enemies. It's the only thing that makes sense anymore." September 2nd, 1945. Japan surrendered. The war was over. But for Hilda Brenner, the waiting had just begun. 2 years. 2 years of letters to Catholic Relief Services. 2 years of negotiations with Soviet authorities who saw German orphans as bargaining chips. 2 years of waking up not knowing if Klaus and Werner were eating, sleeping, surviving. 2 years of Greta watching Hilda eat every meal like a prayer, setting aside portions in case the boys are hungry when they arrive. 2 years of O'Malley making phone calls, writing letters, pulling every string he had in the military and the church. In August 1947, the call finally came. Catholic Relief Services had successfully negotiated the release of 47 German orphans from Soviet-controlled orphanages in East Berlin. Among them, Klaus Brenner, now 13 years old, and Werner Brenner, now 10. They would arrive at New York Harbor on August 27, 1947. O'Malley drove Hilda to New York himself. Greta asked to come along. She needed to see this. Needed to know that some families were being reunited. That some stories had better endings than hers. The harbor was chaos. Hundreds of refugees arriving daily from Europe. Displaced persons, orphans, survivors. The 3 of them stood on the dock, scanning the gangplank as children descended from the transport ship. Most of them looked like Greta had looked 3 months earlier. Hollow, starving, eyes that had seen too much. Then Hilda gasped. 2 boys were coming down the gangplank.
The older one was taller than Hilda remembered. The younger had a scar across his left cheek that hadn't been there before. Both moved with the careful precision of people who'd learned that energy was currency. Hilda ran forward, stopped a few feet away. The boys stared at her with empty eyes. "Klaus Werner. It's Mutti. It's your mother." Klaus 13 looked at her with something that might have been recognition or might have been wishful thinking. His voice was flat. "Where sind Sie? Who are you?" The words hit Hilda like a physical blow. 2 years. 2 years of starvation and Soviet brutality had erased their memory of her. Or maybe they were protecting themselves. Maybe acknowledging her meant acknowledging hope, and hope was dangerous. Hilda's knees buckled. O'Malley caught her elbow, steadied her. She knelt on the dock, began singing softly. A lullaby. Guten Abend, gute Nacht, mit Rosen bedacht. Werner's eyes flickered, changed. His entire body went rigid. Mutter. The word was barely a whisper. Then he collapsed forward into Hilda's arms. Klaus followed a second later. All three of them kneeling on the dock, holding each other, 2 years of separation breaking like a dam. Greta stood back, tears streaming down her face. O'Malley's hand found her shoulder. "See," he said quietly, "some people get their mothers back, and some don't. No, but you honor yours by living well, just like those boys will honor what their mother did to find them." They took the boys to a nearby diner, fed them slowly. Soup first, then bread, then small portions of real food, watching carefully to make sure they didn't make themselves sick. Klaus and Werner ate in silence, looking up between every bite, as if expecting the food to be taken away. Greta recognized the behavior. She'd done the same thing 3 months earlier. "How long since you ate a real meal?" O'Malley asked in careful German. Klaus thought about it. His voice was flat, emotionless. "January, maybe February, this year. 6 months. Even after the war ended, even after the Soviets agreed to release them, these boys had been starving for 6 more months while paperwork was processed, while bureaucrats in Moscow and Washington argued over details, while the world celebrated peace and tried to pretend everything was fine." Werner spoke for the first time since the reunion. His voice was small. "They said the war was over. They said food would come. It didn't." Hilda's hand tightened on his shoulder. "It's here now, and it won't stop. I promise you." Klaus looked at his mother with ancient eyes in a 13-year-old face. "You promised you'd come back. That took 2 years." The words hung in the air like an accusation, but there was no anger in them, just exhausted statement of fact. "I know," Hilda whispered. "I know, and I'm sorry. But I'm here now, and I'm never leaving you again." But they were alive, and they were with their mother, and slowly, cautiously, they were beginning to believe the food wouldn't stop. Greta's transfer to Philadelphia was scheduled for September 15th, 1945. 6 months after her arrival. 6 months that had transformed her from a 67-pound ghost into a 104-pound woman with a future. September 15th arrived with summer heat that felt like a benediction after the cold spring of her arrival. Greta stood in the camp yard with a small suitcase containing everything she owned: 3 dresses, 2 pairs of shoes, her journal and the folder containing her mother's death certificate. She weighed 104 pounds, healthy, almost normal. Sergeant O'Malley drove her to the train station himself. They rode in silence for most of the trip. What was there to say he'd saved her life? She would never be able to repay him. Thank you seemed insufficient. At the station, he carried her suitcase to the platform. The train to Philadelphia was already waiting, steam rising from its engine like breath. "You're going to do great things," O'Malley said. "I know it. I'm going to operate a radio and try not to forget English grammar." "That's how it starts. Give it time." Greta held out her hand for a formal handshake. O'Malley looked at it, then pulled her into a brief, careful hug, like a father might hug a daughter, like family. "Write me," he said. "Let me know how you're doing." "I will." And Greta, your mother would be proud. Whatever else you believe, believe that." The words hit harder than Greta expected. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She boarded the train, found her seat, watched through the window as O'Malley stood on the platform, hands in his pockets, looking smaller as the train pulled away. Philadelphia became home slowly, then all at once. The Presbyterian Church provided a small room in their boarding house. The radio station was professional and well-equipped. Her supervisor, a man named Robert Hayes, was patient with her English and impressed by her technical knowledge. The work was simple operating equipment, managing signal strength, occasionally translating German news broadcasts. It wasn't exciting. It was exactly what Greta needed: routine, stability, purpose. She made one friend in those early months. Another boarder named Catherine Walsh, an Irish-American woman whose family had fled the potato famine 2 generations before. Catherine worked as a secretary and had opinions about everything. She took Greta to movies, taught her American slang, explained baseball with the patience of a saint. "You're too serious," Catherine said one evening over dinner. "You need to learn to have fun." "I'm learning to live," Greta replied. "Fun comes later." But slowly fun did come. A movie that made her laugh. A radio show that became her weekly ritual. The discovery that she liked coffee with cream and sugar that autumn in Philadelphia was beautiful, that she could walk through the city without calculating energy expenditure. In March 1946, Greta cooked corned beef and cabbage in the boarding house kitchen. She'd never cooked it before, had to get the recipe from an Irish neighbor, but she managed. The smell filled the hallway: salt and meat and butter. Catherine tried it skeptically. "This is what you eat to celebrate. This is what I eat to remember." She wrote to Sergeant O'Malley that night, telling him about the meal. He wrote back 2 weeks later with news: Hilda's boys were thriving. Klaus had started school. Werner was gaining weight. They still had nightmares, but they were healing. Greta cried reading the letter. Some families were being reunited. Some stories had better endings than hers. In May 1948, Greta met Nathaniel Brighton. He came to the radio station to repair equipment, a tall man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too much. He'd been a signal corpsman in Europe, had landed at Normandy, had worked communications through France and Germany. They talked about radio frequencies and signal propagation. Then they talked about the war. Then they talked about everything else. Nate had his own ghosts, his own nightmares, his own guilt about surviving when friends hadn't. They understood each other in the way that only people who'd seen the worst of humanity could understand each other. Their first date was coffee. Their second was a movie. Their third was a long walk where Nate told her about the things he'd seen in Germany and Greta told him about the things she'd survived. "I was the enemy," she said. "Doesn't that bother you? You were a girl operating a radio. I was a guy fixing radios. The only enemy was the people who started the war, not the people who got caught in it." They married in March 1950. Small ceremony. Catherine as maid of honor. Robert Hayes gave Greta away. And in the front row in full-dress uniform sat Sergeant Patrick O'Malley, who'd driven 6 hours from Pennsylvania to attend. At the reception, O'Malley toasted, "To Greta and Nate. May your marriage be long, your meals be abundant, and your kindness to strangers be infinite." Everyone drank. Greta caught O'Malley's eye across the room, mouthed, "Thank you." He raised his glass higher. "Thank your mother. She's the one who made sure you survived to get here." The years passed. Greta and Nate bought a small house in a Philadelphia suburb. She continued working at the radio station. He started his own radio repair business. They were happy in the quiet way that people who'd survived trauma could be happy, grateful for ordinary days, for meals shared, for the absence of fear. In March 1952, their daughter was born. They named her Maeve Irish to honor O'Malley. She had Nate's eyes and Greta's stubborn chin. In March 1954, their son arrived, Connor, also Irish, also a tribute. Every St. Patrick's Day, Greta cooked corned beef and cabbage. As the children grew, they would ask why. She told them, "This meal saved my life. This meal taught me that kindness matters more than nationality. This meal is how I honor everyone who helped me survive. The children grew up American, English as their first language, German something their mother spoke on the phone to other immigrants. They knew about the war only in abstract terms, something that had happened before they were born in a place they'd never seen. That was exactly what Greta wanted. On March 10th, 1965, 20 years and 1 day after she'd left her mother in Berlin, a letter arrived. Red Cross, official seal. Greta's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a death certificate she'd already received 20 years earlier. But also something new, a letter, handwritten in German, dated March 10th, 1945. Found in the ruins of their apartment building during reconstruction work in 1964, addressed to Margarete meine Tochter, Margaret, my daughter. Greta sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd served countless St. Patrick's Day dinners, and read her mother's last words. Meine Liebste Margarete, I don't know if you are alive.
I don't know if you will ever read this, but I must write it while I still have strength. I gave you my bread because you are young. You have life ahead. I am 51. I have lived enough. If you survived, if you are reading this, I have one command. Live. Eat well. Laugh loudly. Love completely. Do not waste one day feeling guilty that you lived when I did not. I chose this. Every mother would choose this. Find joy, Margaret. Find it and hold it and name your children after it. The neighbor tells me the Americans are kind to prisoners. I hope this is true. I hope they feed you. I hope they see you as a person, not an enemy. If they do, then the propaganda was wrong. If they do, then maybe the world has more kindness than we were told. Live for both of us, meine Tochter. Live fiercely. That is how you honor me. Ich liebe dich für immer, Mutti. Greta read it 3 times. Then she set it down, carefully walked to her stove, and began cooking. Corned beef, cabbage, potatoes. The meal that had taught her mother's lesson before she'd ever read these words. When Nate came home, he found her in the kitchen crying over a pot of boiling cabbage. Greta! She showed him the letter. He read it silently, then pulled her close. She knew, Greta whispered. She knew I'd feel guilty. She knew I'd need permission to live. She gave it to me 20 years ago, and I'm only reading it now. Better late than never. That night they ate as a family. Maeve was 13 now, Connor 11, old enough to understand when Greta read them their grandmother's letter, old enough to see their mother cry and understand it was grief mixed with gratitude. Your grandmother died so I could live, Greta told them. Today we honor her by eating this meal and being grateful for every single bite, by living fiercely and wasting nothing, not one day, not one opportunity for joy. The children ate solemnly, understanding perhaps for the first time the weight their mother had carried, the price their existence had cost. After dinner, Connor asked, Mom, are you glad you came to America? Greta considered the question. 20 years of life in this country, marriage, children, safety, abundance, freedom from fear. Germany was where I was born, she said finally, but America is where I learned to live. Yes, sweetheart, I'm glad. St. Patrick's Day, 2003. Greta Brighton née Keller was 82 years old. Nate had died 2 years earlier. The house felt too big now, too empty, but every March 17th it filled with family. Maeve arrived first with her husband and 2 teenage children, then Connor with his wife and 3 younger kids. The dining room table extended to accommodate all 9 people. Greta cooked the meal herself despite Maeve's protests. The ritual mattered, the doing of it, the smell of corned beef filling the house, the muscle memory of preparing food for people she loved. When they sat down to eat, her youngest grandchild, Connor's daughter Emma, age 7, asked the question all the grandchildren eventually asked. Grandma, why do we eat this every year? We're not Irish. Greta smiled. She'd prepared for this question, had been preparing for it for 58 years. We eat this meal because it taught me something important. It taught me that kindness has a taste, and that taste is corned beef and cabbage served by a man who chose to see people instead of enemies. She pulled out a yellowed envelope. Inside was a letter dated November 1989. She'd received it 14 years ago, had read it at every St. Patrick's Day dinner since. "Sergeant O'Malley wrote this before he died. I want you to hear it." She read aloud, "Dear Greta, I'm dying cancer, the doctors say. But I wanted you to know feeding you and those 17 other women was the most important thing I ever did in the war.
We beat the Nazis with tanks and bombs, but I beat them with bacon. I proved that Americans don't become monsters just because our enemies were. My grandmother died thinking the world had no kindness. I made sure 18 women knew different. Thank you for living well. It justified everything. Your friend Patrick O'Malley." Silence around the table. Then Emma spoke. "He saved you with food. He saved me with kindness. The food was just how he delivered it." They ate. Greta watched her family, children and grandchildren, 3 generations that existed because a man had chosen compassion over cruelty, because her mother had chosen sacrifice over survival, because she had chosen to accept both gifts and live fiercely. After dinner, Maeve found her mother in the kitchen washing dishes. "Mom, I found something in your desk. A letter you wrote. It's addressed to us but marked, 'Open after my death.' Should I have not looked?" Greta smiled. "You can read it now. I'm 82. "After my death could be tomorrow." Maeve retrieved the letter, read it aloud. "To my children and grandchildren, I weighed 67 pounds when Americans saved me. They didn't have to. I was the enemy. But Sergeant Patrick O'Malley fed me anyway. He taught me that survival isn't enough, you must live well. Every March 17th, I cooked corned beef and cabbage, not because I'm Irish, because that meal taught me what my mother's letter confirmed. The greatest way to honor the dead is to live fiercely, love completely, and waste nothing, not one day, not one opportunity for joy. Don't mourn me, eat corned beef, laugh, that's the victory. Your mother, Greta." Maeve's eyes were wet. "Mom, you're not dying anytime soon." "No," Greta agreed. "But when I do, I want you to know I lived well. Your grandmother's sacrifice wasn't wasted. Sergeant O'Malley's kindness wasn't wasted. I turned 67 pounds of despair into a whole life. That's enough." She died 8 months later, November 18th, 2003, peacefully in her sleep. At the funeral, her children displayed a photograph Greta at 24, standing between Sergeant O'Malley and Private Kowalski, March 17th, 1945, holding a plate of corned beef and cabbage, smiling for the first time since Berlin burned. Below it, they placed a plaque, Margaret, Greta Keller Brighton, 1921 to 2003. She weighed 67 pounds when kindness saved her. She lived 82 years, proving kindness was enough. And every March 17th, her children and grandchildren gather. They cook corned beef and cabbage. They read O'Malley's letter and Ilse Keller's letter and Greta's letter. They eat. They remember. They honor the dead by living fiercely, because that's what Greta taught them. That's what her mother taught her. That's what Sergeant Patrick O'Malley taught them all. Kindness has a taste. And that taste is corned beef and cabbage served to enemies who became family in a country built on second chances by people who chose to see humans instead of combatants. That's the story. That's the victory. That's how you win a war without firing a shot. You feed them. You show them kindness when they expect cruelty. You prove that the propaganda was wrong. And 60 years later, their grandchildren gather around tables to celebrate the meal that changed everything. In 2024, the Fort Indian Town Gap Military Museum displays a memorial plaque. It lists 18 names under the heading, "The Women Who Learned America Tastes Like Kindness." First name on the list, Margaret Keller Brighton, 1921 to 2003. Visitors stop, read the names, ask the docent about the story, and the docent tells them about 32 German women who arrived weighing an average of 71 pounds. About an Irish-American sergeant who fed them corned beef because his grandmother had starved. About 18 women who chose to stay to build lives to raise American children who would never know hunger. The story ends the way all good stories end, not with revenge, not with punishment, not with justice measured in blood, but with a meal, a choice, a second chance, and grandchildren who gather every March 17th to prove that kindness once given echoes through generations. That's the taste of victory, and it tastes like corned beef and cabbage.